So let's talk about the theory about the planting methods and some of the terminology around VSPro. This is going to be very important so you don't get confused because VSPro is extremely powerful and this is going to be introduction into some of the ways that you can plant so you'll understand um, some of the capabilities. So there are two main ways that VSPro can plant, okay? One is called, if you want to call it persistent brush, some people call it persistence, traditional brush, some people call it manual planting, but it's very similar to the Unity native planting tools, which is you move your mouse around, you click, and you plant, okay? So that's pretty straightforward. It uses a concept of what we call baked vegetation, and I'm going to explain the difference between that in another slide, but just know that anything we call persistent is also what we call baked. With this method, you can plant on anything with a collider, and you can also plant on terrains and anything, but planting on a collider can come in handy because you can essentially plant on top of a rock. So if you want to put a bush on top of a rock, as long as that rock has a collider on it, you can do it. But this can also cause problems. You'll be clicking around, and if your tree has a collider on it, the next thing you know, you're putting a rock on the top of a tree, or you're putting a tree on top of another tree. So it's great, you can do it, and you can turn it on and off, but you also need to understand when it happens and how to stop it, okay? So that's traditional brush painting, so that's one way to do it, and you'll be doing a lot of it. It's very precise. If you need to put a tree in an exact location, you're probably going to use the traditional brush, persistent, or what we call manual planting. The second way is what we call planting by rules. And this is one of the main reasons, and this is the big time saver for VSPro, is planting by rules. And again, I'm going to go into more details of what that means, but it is the main reason you bought VSPro. In order to plant by rules, you have to define a terrain. So planting by rules will only plant on a terrain, and it'll plant on a Unity terrain, and namely, we're going to be using foliage for that. You can also create what we call a mesh terrain, so you can turn any object into a terrain, and there's a procedure to do that. I don't think we're going to cover it in this course. It's more of an advanced topic, but you can plant on a mesh terrain as well, but we're going to be planting on our foliage terrain, which we created already, and that is a Unity terrain. There are two main ways to plant by rules we're going to cover in the next slides here, but keep in mind, one thing is like rules planted, if you plant anything based on rules, you can convert those to persistent or baked vegetation as well. And that'll make sense in the next couple of slides here. So let's explain the difference between persistent and rules planting. So in rules planting, essentially what you're doing is you're creating rules, and then VSPro follows those rules to determine where, what to plant. So for example, and this is very simplified, but you might have a rule that says, hey, starting here, plant an oak tree every 10 feet. And every time you plant it, vary its height by 10%. Every time you plant it, rotate it 25 degrees or randomly. Don't plant it on really steep slopes, and don't plant it anywhere where the terrain is higher than 100 feet from our base level, okay? So another part of that same rules planning could be, okay, and then starting here, plant this other tree, a maple tree, plant this one every 8 feet, but only vary its height by 8% randomly. Rotate it 10 degrees kind of randomly, and then plant it everywhere regardless of how steep the terrain is or how high or how elevated it is. So then you can see is that VSPro will use that information and bam, it just plants everything for you, and you've got this big area covered by your maples and your oak trees now. On the other hand, persistent planting is a different approach. For this one, you're going to have more or less just a list of all the trees, the types, and the size details and where they're located. So you might say, hey, this oak tree, I want to plant that oak tree right here at location A. So that's one tree. And then move down the list. I wanted this other oak tree, but it's going to be this size right here. And then next thing you know, I got this maple tree, plant it this size right here. So every tree is a separate location, and it's more like a database, okay? So we got rules, and then we got persistent planting, which is more of like a list of trees and where they're located. And you can convert rules-based trees to persistent planting trees. But what you can't do is you can't convert persistent planting trees back to rules. And that should logically make sense. You just can't all of a sudden make up rules on all these things that are planted by this list. So rules planting and persistent planting. So when we plant by rules, okay, we've got two primary methods for doing that. One is we can do a thing, and this is what we recommend to the newer folks. This is what we call biome spawning. And essentially with biome spawning, what we're doing is we use a mask, which is more or less just like drawing out like an area. And we say, okay, in this area, I want you to plant based on my rules method, but just in this isolated area. And the area could be, it could just be an area around a green, really small, or it could be huge. It could be circling like a mountain area. And then using the rules I create, use those rules in that entire area. The masks that I'm talking about, we have a couple different kind of masks. We got biomass prefabs, and think of this as like an Inkscape spline. You know how we draw those circles in Inkscape, or RAM polygon. If you watch the RAM tutorials, you draw an area, but we're basically using it for planning. So instead of modifying the terrain, we're saying, hey, in this area, I want you to draw this particular grouping of trees by rules. Okay. We also have a thing called a vegetation mask area, which is the opposite of a biomask in that it removes vegetation um, from a particular area. So let's say you draw a huge area and you just want to remove something from a little subset of that, you can draw a mask. And we also have an idea of a mask line, which is it's similar to a mask area, but the shape is it's like a cart path. And this comes in handy. Let's say you plant a huge area of trees, but they're planting on your cart path. You could use that to exclude your cart paths, right? So that's biome spawning, which we're going to go into. Another method, which we're not going to cover as part of this series, and it's covered in Discord, and there's some other videos around it if you want to try it later on. But it's image-based mask, and that is when we take like an image. We could use our Inkscape splines, and we could draw specifically on just our Inkscape splines. And there's things that we do with exceptions and includes. It can get rather complicated, rather confusing. We use a default biome. It is fairly powerful. There are specific cases where you want to use it, but we're not going to cover it here. It's more of an advanced topic.